Hello,
We're back again.
he's Shabazz.
He's Pete Marshall, and this is Crypto UK. And what are we talking about today, Pete?
Brexit. Yay! We don't have enough, in Britain, we don't have enough discussions on Brexit, obviously. Just
Yeah.
never enough.
And it's, to be honest, it's usually a boring topic.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
with now it becoming a reality, it's like we have to face up to reality.
and honestly, we have to start planning. And with that, we have to actually discuss it and try to get away from some of the larger amounts of nonsense around the entire topic. So I think the first thing to discuss is why we haven't been talking about it before, because I think honestly there is two very important principles which kind of don't get enough. Which the first one is that as soon as you get into almost any Brexit policy, you're almost entirely into like nonsense language, and basically all words become completely meaningless in any kind of policy context. And so there ends up being very little point in. So actually most of the people who are working specifically on this, it's just so complicated that it's just not worth listening to. The other problem is that as soon as people start going anywhere near Brexit policy, especially in government, especially around the Conservative Party, they start lying so much that honestly it's barely worth like taking them. I would almost bet more money on the fact that they're going to turn out to be wrong, or they're going to contradict themselves in 2 weeks, than I would bet money on the fact that they're actually going to be right about what they say. So both of these principles make it almost becomes meaningless for most of the time to talk about what Brexit policy means, because in any kind of lived perspective, it means very little. But yes, so that's why we don't normally talk about it. But as kind of we've got to a point where kind of everyone acknowledges it's final crunch time, and as it's becoming increasingly obvious how the cards are coming down, it seems kind of worth talking about. And given that it's going to be very close to the context, just to say this was recorded on Thursday. So honestly, that is the day that Boris Johnson came away from his lunch that he said that sweet reason would carry them through, and then it subsequently didn't. So honestly, we've got apparently 4 more days, but obviously.
And today the European Union have published their contingency plan for a no-deal Brexit.
And the BBC had an article as well talking about inflation. And honestly, yeah, that's going to be one of our larger topics.
Yeah. I just think that, with it now happening, we've just got to make sure that, we all collectively minimize our suffering. And our hardship, which is inevitably going to come.
I mean, I think
this is on top of. Bear in mind, this is on top of an already drastic health situation where we're in the middle of a pandemic, and that pandemic has not gone anywhere yet, and we're doing Brexit in the middle of that.
I mean, I think that there is a discussable point here, which honestly sounds almost too partisan to be fair, but equally, I don't think we can actually not talk about it, which is basically, I don't know how to interpret how people who voted for Brexit what they were thinking, in the sense that basically everybody who knows about this topic, and quite a few people who don't know about this topic, said that this is going to be a disaster, who said that this is not going to work. And a significant amount of people went, nah, I want to give it a try anyway. And basically, and essentially, they're not going to get what they want. I mean, honestly, one of the most bizarre things that's happened this week is basically Michael Gove came out and said, yeah, there's going to be a border, either almost certainly not within Ireland, almost certainly between Scotland, Wales, and England and Ireland. And basically, that's been agreed now. That's just history. Anyone who doesn't like that, that's now reality. So basically, even if you like, so, and that was apparently something that all the Brexiteers hated, and they hated that idea. But I don't know what to say. Well, apparently Boris Johnson couldn't do that. Apparently, all the people who told you that was an option, they were lying. And that's kind of part of what I meant. It is, and so if you are, just as, so I think, honestly, like, there is a political question as to, basically there's going to be two massive groups who are going to be incredibly unhappy that make up almost the entire British population. There is going to be people who wanted Brexit but didn't want it to like destroy the UK and like break up the UK. Well, they're obviously not getting what they want. Sorry. And people who wanted to stay in Europe and didn't want to go through massive economic turmoil, well, they're not going to get what they want, apparently. So, and I think there's kind of two things here. Of there is the mass healing that has to go on in order to like keep Britain like marginally sane, and then there is the point of like, okay, but a significant chunk of British population apparently just was perfectly happy not living in reality. They were just like, yeah, reality is too much for us. We can't deal with this, so we're just going to go Brexit and just pretend and go just on a make-believe train for the next couple of years, and we're going to take everyone else with us because that's just what's going to happen now. Yeah. It seems really unfair, but I'm sorry, like everybody told you that these things were not going to happen. Everybody who knew about it told you they were not going to happen. You went with Michael Gove, who told you, yeah, we're just sick of experts. We just don't care about people who know stuff about stuff. And that was the argument that many of these people went with, of just like, meh. And they were like, that seems like the most reasonable option here. Yeah, that was never the most reasonable option. And the fact that, yeah, so basically, Boris Johnson at this point has broken so many like promises to his own voters, and basically like I have at some point like I don't this becomes almost an ethical issue. This becomes almost a, well, do you actually like, is lying actually a flaw, or is it just a feature? Is this part of what you were voting for? Or because everyone knew he was a liar, like it was said so many times during the last election. And honestly, anyone who voted for him anyway, I don't know what to say. If you want to go, well, Jeremy Corbyn was bad, like I'm not going to relitigate. But if you went into this thinking that, yeah, because I want to vote for Boris Johnson because I think he's going to get Brexit done, I don't know what to say. And you were obviously very, very wrong. And it was kind of obvious at the time.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that for me it's become like, I've learned a lot over the last couple of years, and I feel that we as a developed nation have become like a developing nation in terms of the way we do our politics and the way we run by emotion rather than reason and argument and all of those wonderful democratic things, and it's become a bit like make America great again. Brexit was a bit like we need the British Empire to rise again, So for me,
I
it
mean,
became a much more of an emotional argument that people were doing rather than an actual practical. What does this mean in practice?
I
And
mean, one of the most,
that's what I think
I mean,
people have sold people down the river
I
with.
mean, one of the most fascinating things about Brexit, and in many ways, this is a thought experiment. So to some degree, yeah, it has, um, is the British state kind of doesn't exist, or is only a very, very new thing. Because if you look at, because basically we started having empires, we've had three empires, and basically that started in the Tudor period, Queen Elizabeth the First. Then you go back to basically, and that has been a thing since about the 1950s. And so basically our economics, our politics, our all of the bureaucratic institutions were designed not to run a state, but to run an empire. And so and honestly, the kind of the British political zeitgeist. And honestly, this becomes a problem when basically you start having discussions about the British state and whether it could and Europe that relationship, because basically the only time the British state has been outside of, or the United Kingdom, you might say, has been outside of kind of an empire of places, or outside of the EU, was like for like 10 years when things were really, really, really bad. And that was like, so basically our good times have either been in an empire or in the EU, which is basically a trade union where no one pays any tariffs, and basically everything is kind of has artificially low inflation, yada yada yada. So it's in that sense, it like saying that the British state, we can just leave the EU without, and the British state will just continue, was always a bizarre idea, just hypothetically, just as a notion, because there, the because our islands just have always been part of much larger trade blocks, except for when things have been not so good. So, in terms of how, so yeah, anyway,
And
but
just
that was
before
never but that was never how the discussion was had. Everyone was always like, well, we can exist outside of like the EU, and it was just like, well, we can, but like it was really
I,
bad when we did.
I just want to remind people that when David Cameron won one of his last elections, on the end of his speech, he said, "Let's make Britain greater still," you know, and that was in his first address after he won the election. So, but moving on now,
Yeah,
I'm
all of
just
that's hypothetical.
uh, but all of that history and all of that said, what do we do now, and how
I
does
mean,
it affect us our day to day life now?
I mean, basically 98% of the effect of Brexit is going to be inflation. And and obviously it's almost unfair to say, yes, of course, it was promised to everyone when we were voting for Brexit that there wouldn't be inflation. And yes, of course, economists said there would be inflation. And basically, like today, the BBC came out with an official article saying, yes, there will be massive inflation. It's also worth pointing out that there'll be massive difficulty with trade. It won't be quite so bad because like Canada's our largest trade partner that we have a deal for after Brexit with. So we have like a couple of people. So it won't be like nobody. but it will be a lot closer to nobody than we would be comfortable with. I mean, that will expand, obviously. Other countries will want to trade with us. But anyway, basically, the primary problem is going to be the context of basically any and every policy, because inflation is basically stuff getting more expensive despite staying exactly what it is. Now, that means that anybody who is on a fixed income, anybody who is on benefits, anybody whose job relies on their pay being what it is, so those three groups will be massively affected, either by because their employer will just leave because they're like, well, we can only make a profit whilst you're being paid, 15 quid an hour. But if you pay 16 quid an hour, there's no profit for us. So why are we staying? Second, and fixed income, so pensions, benefits, anything like that, stuff gets more expensive unless you have unless things like benefits actually go up, and unless your pension actually has you can get your if you have very expensive pensions, you can have it like inflation locked, so you can actually get more money as inflation goes up. But all of that ends up meaning that essentially the same money will go less far, which is basically mean that everyone's gonna have to ask the government for even more money. And so the question really is, will the government say yes? And I think that's kind of where this thing boils down to, of we're coming back to austerity. And in the end, at this point, the government doesn't have to reduce the amount of funding in order to be doing austerity. It's basically doing austerity by maintaining the same amount of money. So in the end, it depends on how willing they will be to increase that amount of money, and it depends on how ferociously the country is prepared to fight for more. Of course, we could do rationing. That's the other option. The traditional option for how you how you reduce inflation is rationing.
But I don't even know where to go with it now, because you're saying so many things there. But how do you think we should fight the austerity then?
I mean, I think the most obvious one is probably universal basic income. I mean, it's worth pointing out that many people have been on universal basic income. It's called furlough. It's not like, so in many ways, if they want to go, but how would you even do that? Like, we've done it. So in that sense, it's not like, it's become much less of a radical idea because it's still happening. I think is what
it's one of those silver bullet things though that I'm not completely sure about, because the left and the right seem to both equally, certain parts of it seem to equally like it, and I'm a bit unsure about it, because I think if we as a society seem to always want a quick fix. We've come up with this idea of thinking, oh, universal basic income. That sounds good, let's just do it, and that'll solve all our problems.
I mean, let me clarify what I mean in this particular context.
Okay.
What I mean is that if you had universal basic income, which basically acted like furlough, but it was on top of everything else.
Yeah.
And it just took care of the inflation, because honestly, there was some discussion that it's going to be as much as 25%, which is crazy. That's basically, that's a lot. Like, inflation of like 3% would normally be considered to be, that's not great. Inflation of 10% a year is bad. So, and again, that's going to be on a very small number of products, probably the full 25%. But it's not great.
And is that
So
with a deal and without a deal?
With a deal, I mean, there's two things. With a deal will almost certainly carry inflation costs with it, although they will be a lot lower. Without a deal will carry much higher inflation costs. So honestly, basically the reason, one of the things that's captured in inflation is bureaucracy and any kind of tariffs. So basically, if you want to buy brie, there's been loads of discussion about how expensive brie is going to be, and if you want to get brie, which is a French cheese, then you basically then any money that you have to pay over the border to carry goods, any amount of paperwork that a bureaucrat has to hand to the driver in order for the driver to get across the thing, that has to be considered. And of course, all the amount of time they have to spend waiting. Because it's worth pointing out that like most of these systems haven't been created yet, and like one of the things that have been created in the UK is massive parking lots. Because honestly, everyone's fairly certain that there's going to be like traffic jams like miles long of just trucks waiting to get from Europe to Britain. And again, this is because because of Brexit, we've traditionally had zero like tariffs and zero inspections because we've all agreed to go have the same standards of goods. If we decide, as soon as we go, no, we don't want the same standards of goods, then they have to go, okay, well, there has to be an inspection of goods then. We have to know what goods are being brought over, and we have to be able...
Because we've been in Europe, because you said because of Brexit, but we haven't had Brexit yet.
Well, I mean, but basically because of Brexit, we're going to have to install these things, but we haven't had them because we haven't been in Brexit. Yeah. I mean, that is a thing, that one of the weirder aspects of people's attitudes has been that like they go, oh well, we voted for Brexit and things are fine, so all of those namby-pamby like blah blah blah, they're completely wrong. And so yeah, we haven't nothing's changed yet. It is going to start changing, but nothing's changed yet.
Yeah. So how on the ground do we make sure our ways of life are kept to this, at least to the same level, do you think?
I mean, again, I would argue that the problem is that there's no point in thinking about this as like small groups, because basically any small group is going to have extreme difficulty convincing the government to do anything by itself. And because the government's going to have so much to do, and it's not going to be, and honestly, we have such a unpolicy related government that they don't care about doing stuff at the best of times. So honestly, there's not going to be the political will. And there's not going, unless we really, really push. And I think the only group of people who could really, really push is, and I think universal basic income, if we argue for that and say that this is necessary, then disabled people would get involved, would get in that. And actually that would probably be the easiest way. I can't see, the only other ways would be talking about like increasing funding for PIP, increasing funding for various other benefits. And honestly, and I can't see that happening. Like, I would love to be more optimistic, but like, given how much they don't like these things at the best of times, I can't imagine them going, oh, now we're doing Brexit, let's start increasing the amount of money we're spending on benefits.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the other thing to be said here is medication. Because medication is something that we need. Its price is heavily related to how much we end up spending on the NHS. Obviously, the more expensive medication is, like the more chance you have of the NHS either A, saying we're not going to get X amount of funding, so we can't afford to treat this illness, hypothetically. Hopefully it won't get that way, and hopefully the government will continue funding. But the other point here is that actually in the short term, it's really hard to shift large amounts of medication. I mean, one of the more interesting things that happened last week or the week before. Basically, Donald Trump, one of the policy quick fixes that they've been very obsessed with by in the US is buying drugs in from Canada. And traditionally this was illegal, and so it was, but Trump finally signed off on this thing making it legal. Now, that was put on the very same day as Canada banning America from buying drugs from the because they were basically utterly terrified that basically they were going to have a wave of Americans coming north of the border and basically like them not having enough drugs. Now, I think that was, I think it's mostly not individuals coming up, it's mostly stuff getting bought in. So I think, because yeah, that technically they're not allowed to go past the border because COVID. But basic point being that in the short term, the drugs, medication and drugs market is very kind of stable. And so if we would start buying 90% of our medication from Canada and from Japan and from a few other places, then we would probably have extreme difficulty with doing that. Right now, the market is very comfortable going via the EU, and you know how it works after that. And honestly, like best case scenario might well be that all the medication we'd normally be getting from France, Belgium, blah, 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 traveling via France and Belgium would basically have to take an extra trip across the Atlantic to Canada and then be exported from Canada to the UK, which obviously is its own like that costs money. Papers have to be shuffled, boats have to be ordered, you know, stuff has to be transported, and that takes time. So again, that's another element of like, in the end, the NHS will become more expensive because we've decided to do this thing. So so if there's a deal, actually, that's much less of a crisis, because actually we can basically import the same drugs from the same people just for more money. But the other option is that potentially they have to ship the entire lot to Canada, and then from Canada they have to ship the entire lot back to the UK.
Do you know if we have to keep renewing the deal, or if the deal is the deal and that's it?
I mean, real talk, there's basically two, I mean, in terms of like macroeconomics, long-term strategic thinking, there's kind of two discussions about Brexit. In the short term, it is bad, hypothetically very bad. In the medium and long term, there's, you know, it's going to become just the price of doing business, and it's not going to be, and honestly, the main question, and basically people who make it through the year after Brexit and all of that are going to make it through, you know, the next 20. So in that sense, you know, and we're going to get more trade deals over time. We're going to be in a better position for arguing for trade deals. So the trade deals are going to get more in our favor, you know, blah, blah. So honestly, it's going to get better in the long term. So it's not that like things are going, you know, but that's, I mean, there's major
but it's going to lead to the breakup of the UK, right? I think so.
Possibly, probably. I mean, honestly,
Scotland's going to go. Wales is going to go.
Northern Ireland and Scotland, I think, are the two fairly. I mean, honestly, one of the things I think that is the biggest unknown in all this is how well is Europe doing, and this is in many ways is not a question that's asked much. But if you look at places like Hungary and Poland, then they are seriously fucking around with some of the internals of the entire system. And so basically them having laws and them having massive parties against gay political parties against gay people, against that kind of thing. Basically that kind of fractures the entire EU in the sense of they're supposed to be a thing that like their institutions are supposed to be supporting human rights of Europeans. Well, how much do they support the rights of gay Polish people? You know, and honestly, as soon as you start asking those kinds of questions, then systems slowly, then structures start to fracture, and you start getting to either A, people who go, we need Poland to be part of this thing because they are European, and so fuck gay people, or other hypothetical, gay people, you know, I care about gay French people, so I don't, so, you know, we'll have to strike hard at Poland. And you know, it's worth pointing out they're probably not going to in these kinds of contexts. I would love to say that there was like an easy route from a major political party being homophobic to it not being. But honestly, like, if, you know, hypothetically, let's say they did the obvious thing and did some economic and did and some economic kind of stuff and said, okay, now you have to pay, you know, 10% tariffs or whatever. Well, that's probably not actually going to make the party not homophobic. It is probably so. Again, this is so honestly, I think there is a massive question about, and so there's a massive question about kind of the strength of the EU, and there's discussions around Italy leaving. And so I think the only reason for a slight amount of optimism in Scotland is honestly, if the EU is if the EU isn't doing well, and if Britain does not terribly, then then Scotland might not. I mean, honestly, with Ireland, the problem is that's a very specific problem, because basically the EU was the guarantor. The EU and the US are basically guarantors of the peace. And so one of the major things was there will not be a border. And with Biden, if Trump was president, had actually won the presidency, I'd be a lot more pessimistic about this, because honestly, Trump would probably be like, no, we don't care about like a border in Ireland. They can do that, Boris. But with Biden, he has been incredibly explicit about like, yeah, this is something that America very specifically cares about, and you very specifically do not want to cross this line. So it's hard to, and this is part of the thing of, it's hard to imagine that. So it's, no one's talked about a border between Ireland, or between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. The discussion is a border between Wales, Scotland, and England and Northern Ireland. Now, A, that means increased inflation for Northern Ireland for goods that come from Wales, Scotland, and England. But B, it's interesting. There's kind of the two parties in Northern Ireland have very much been looking at this as, how much does England, Scotland and Wales want us to stay in the Union? And they've kind of looked at this as this slow creep. Again, Northern Irish politics is its own discussion. But basically, I think they would regard that as as something of a Catholic victory, and something of a like they're moving towards greater communion. Basically, they'll go into Ireland. I think that's kind of the general expectation about how their politics will move. And it's,
I say something now.
of course.
Yeah, I wanted to make the point of I'm really concerned about the Human Rights Act, and how the European Human Rights Convention kind of safeguards us as disabled people. It's almost like a backstop, you know. It protects us. It kind of protects us against our own government, in a way.
I would.
It's a little stick that you can wave at people.
Well, I mean, I would love to agree with you.
No, hang on. You've had your say.
Okay.
Yeah, and the other thing I would like to say is that you know, the Human Rights Act is a big thing, and the idea of this particular government writing our Human Rights Act doesn't fill me with confidence, and you know, uh, like a British Bill of Rights, if you will. But I don't believe that these people uphold the rule of law at all. After all, this is the Tory party that prorogued Parliament, you know, not so long ago. So, you know, and I'm just worried about it from that angle. And to give you another example, to give everybody another example, the chair I use is a German chair, right? And now when it breaks, they need to get parts for it from Germany. Now, after Brexit, because it's a trade thing, those parts could potentially become harder to get. Yeah. So I'm just giving you a real life practical example as to how materially life could change for me as an individual. Just as an example. Yeah, so because a lot of this discussion and a lot of the discussion around this sort of thing becomes very kind of theoretical and big picture, and it kind of loses people. But and I just wanted to bring it back down to actually what the brass tacks of it and what it actually means for us. It means higher food prices, maybe lower welfare payments, and lower protections and a deregulated economy,
I
which
mean,
is what I worried about.
I think in terms of deregulated economy, there'll be a whole bunch of parliamentary discussions about that. I am somewhat nervous about the fact that one of the things, and actually this has already been talked about as being horrendous, and it's probably going to be, although it's also short term, is basically all the powers that used to be in the EU are being transferred into the executive, which sounds highly theoretical, but basically it means that there will be extremely sweeping powers that will just be able to be made with the swipe of a pen. As apart from normally when you have to like change regulations, you have to do it through Parliament. But actually, if basically a minister can basically say, yeah, I don't feel like, disabled people should be able to, I don't think disabled people should be able to go on a bus. I don't think that's important. And then they just kind of go, okay, get me the regulation, and then they just take off their signature and go, there, boom, and that's no longer a thing. So I think that, and honestly, there's been massive discussions, even in Parliament, about the constitutionality of that in the UK, because honestly, that's traditionally like Parliament is the thing, and the Prime Minister is like the creature of Parliament. He is the Prime Minister. A minister is a person who is all of our prime ministers, all of our executives are supposed to be or are members of Parliament, and they are basically given tasks by Parliament to do. So it's not an argument. So it's not like the American government where actually like the president is the head of the executive, and so they have massive sweeping powers. Like in the UK, the executive should be given as little powers as is physically possible. And so honestly, that's one of those constitutionally questionable bits. And honestly, that's one of the things that we should push hardest on. And actually, it's going to be hard to constitutionally argue over it for them, because unless they want to go, well, I like the power to change massive regulations. Well, they will like it, but they shouldn't have it.
And they have got a majority of 80.
Yeah, but it's worth pointing out that actually that's not even very popular in the Conservative Party. Like, remember that basically what they're doing would be questioned by the left wing, who are generally seen as like big government people. But honestly, basically what they're doing is creating vast government using the party who is small government. Again, they have, masses of conservative MPs have come out against this already. Just to say on the human rights bill, I think, and again, honestly, this has been talked about before, that human rights, it is not possible. Basically, we have had, one of the things with austerity is we've had a kind of human rights, the people from the UN come around and say that Britain is failing in its human rights towards disabled people. And what happened? Nothing. That is within the period of us being within, human rights. So seriously, I think in some ways, I think the entire notion of, so because the Human Rights Act hasn't been like, it's not part of British law. It's never been part of British law. So I think, and fundamentally speaking, the only groups who enforce law is armies and like the police. So unless you decide to have a UN police force, the UN Convention on Human Rights does not have the power of law. I think in some ways what will literally be happening is going to be fairly similar, but the context in which it will be happening is going to be entirely different. And I think that is going to be that's the thing to watch, and that will be the greatest change. Because if you get the same benefits you do now, but food is much more expensive. If you're a pensioner and you get the same level of pension as you do now, but food is much more expensive, then functionally speaking, you will be in a situation where, like, can you pay your gas bill? Can you pay your electricity bill? It's so, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, do you want to say anything else before we wrap up?
I think what you talked about with the wheelchair special, like, I think one of the goods to watch that will probably be given fairly little concentration in terms of most of these trade deals is actually kind of specialist gear around disabilities and ensuring that those kinds of things get traded at a decent price and inflation.
And what about the vaccine, for example?
Yes, no. One of the funnier things this week, there was one of Boris Johnson's ministers decided to be like, one of the great things about Brexit is we can put in the vaccine before anyone else. No, like literally, like we aren't the first. Like literally speaking, like this is all perfectly fine within European law. Everything that we're doing now, we could do it if we were part of Europe or if we weren't part of Europe. It's fine. So yeah. But in terms of how easy will it be to trade? How cheap will it be after Brexit? Distinct question. I don't know the answer to that particular question. It's worth pointing out that many of the manufacturers and people are kind of European. Maybe we'll just have to buy it more expensively, like ship it to Canada and then ship it to the UK.
Yeah. And just in case nobody's guessed, I think Brexit is a very bad idea. And I just wanted to say that for the record.
Ditto.
I'm
Again,
happy to be wrong.
I'm
happy to be wrong, but what we know now is not looking good.
I will just say I would disagree with that only in the sense that I think that one of the most exhausting parts of one of the most exhausting things is debating with people on the obvious.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think honestly, it's a bit like vaccines. I don't if you genuinely want to believe that vaccines or climate change don't exist. Fine. I'm not having this debate with you because it's pointless. Because honestly, like, I've tried this and there is absolutely literally like nothing that, I'm right. And honestly, with Brexit, I think like for the last, honestly, for a long time now, it's just been completely obvious that this is a bad idea. And the fact that people just continue doing it and some people continue supporting it, just honestly, I think it says more about them than it does about like their like appreciation of the facts and their like finely nuanced like watching of the political realities and stuff. Anyway.
And should we end it there?
Yeah, I think so. Right. Hope everyone enjoyed it. See you next week.
Bye.